Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're journeying back to the classical world. Not just to, look at ruins or read philosophy in a vacuum.
No, definitely not.
We're investigating something much more visceral, I suppose. Something that really reveals the core of ancient society.
Yeah.
How they punished people.
Exactly. The art of punishment. It tells you so much about what a society values, what it fears, its whole power structure, really.
It's like the ultimate stress test for their values. We've got legal texts, we've got Plato, Cicero, historical accounts from Thucydides, Tacitus, a whole stack of material.
Yeah, quite a bit.
And we're going to use it all to understand how Greece and Rome actually, managed violence and wrongdoing.
It's a crucial area, though, let's be honest, often pretty grim. Our mission here is to compare classical Greece, mostly Athens and Rome. We want to look at why they punished, was it deterrence, retribution, sometimes, maybe even reform?
And how, the methods themselves.
Right. How did they do it? Fines, exile, crucifixion. These weren't just punishments, they were messages, and almost always tied to who you were, your status.
That idea of calibration is key, isn't it? It wasn't just law, it was performance, theater almost, designed to uphold authority, status, the whole shebang.
Absolutely. So let's start at the philosophical beginning with the Greek idea of justice itself.
DK. Sounds neat and tidy, but the sources suggest it was anything but. What does something like the Oresteia tell us about how messy this idea was from the start?
Well, the Oresteia is fascinating because it's basically the founding myth, the charter myth, scholars call it, for the Athenian legal system, for the polis itself.
Right, the story of moving from blood feud to courts.
Exactly. It shows the shift away from that endless cycle of vendetta, the Furies demanding blood for blood, towards Athena establishing a public court. But, and this is the crucial bit, it's not shown as some perfect, clean break.
Okay.
The Furies, those primal forces of revenge, they aren't destroyed or banished, they're sort of pacified, brought into the system as the Eumenides, the kindly ones.
So that raw need for vengeance, for retribution, it's still there, just sort of contained or managed by the state.
Precisely. The play resolves the immediate violence, sets up a civic, rational court, sure. But it acknowledges that the problems, the ambiguities around justice, or deco, they're still active. Deco has to somehow hold both that ancient demand for payback and the need for civic order.
It stops the endless killing and sets up a male-dominated order, but it admits that desire for personal revenge. Well, never fully goes away, does it?
Never fully legislated out of existence. And it's into this, complex reality that philosophers tried to inject higher ideals, like the idea that punishment could actually be good for the person being punished.
As the reform idea, right? Aristotle, Plato.
Yeah, that's the idealistic strand. Plato, especially in his later work, The Laws, really pushes this idea. He suggests, for instance, that a master treating slaves fairly, or anyone treating their inferiors justly, actually helps cultivate virtue in them.
So punishment is a kind of harsh education for people lacking wisdom.
Kind of. It's this paternalistic view that external control, even painful discipline, can improve someone's character. It shifts the goalposts from just paying a debt to society to something about improving the individual soul.
Sounds like a convenient philosophy for justifying existing hierarchies, though.
Yeah.
Did Athenian judges actually buy into this seat of virtue idea in practice, or was it just nice theory?
It seems mostly theoretical, maybe a bit of philosophical window dressing for the state's actions. When you look at the actual historical records, the day-to-day legal stuff, the goals were far more down to earth.
Retribution and deterrence, making sure people paid and making sure others didn't try the same thing.
Exactly. But the Athenian version of this was tangled up with something else. Private feuds. Ecthra.
Ah, yes, ectra. We tend to think of feuds as something before law or outside of it. But you're saying in Athens it was part of the system.
Absolutely woven in. The custom of ecthra, enmity, feud was flexible. You could settle a dispute with violence, you could go to court, or sometimes, a bit of both. And here's the really key thing for Athens. The community didn't necessarily see personal vengeance. The phrase was dekon hyper auto leben, taking justice for oneself as automatical opposed to the public interest.
That feels really counterintuitive to us now. We think of state prosecution as impartial, for the public good only.
An Athenian prosecutor often didn't see it that way. They'd actively argue to the jury, look, convicting this guy satisfies my personal need for revenge, and it upholds the city's laws. It serves both.
So your personal grievance could actually be proof of your commitment to justice.
In a way, yes. The sources mention Diodorus prosecuting Androtion. He basically says his personal enmity makes him the ideal prosecutor because he's got the drive, the passion to see this bad guy punished, which benefits everyone by reinforcing the law. Public law in Athens often functioned as a way to manage and channel these very powerful pre-existing private drives for vengeance.
Okay, so Athenian law didn't try to stamp out the private feud, the ecthra. It sort of regulated it. Gave people a public stage, the court, to fight it out with words instead of just fists.
Sure. That's a good way to put it. It offered an alternative arena. It required a kind of strategic thinking from the person who'd been wronged. Do I escalate the violence and risk becoming the bad guy myself? Or do I use the law to frame myself as the honorable injured citizen?
And the case of Ariston versus Conan really shows that choice in action, right? Ariston gets beaten up pretty badly.
Horribly beaten up by Conan and his sons. But instead of grabbing his friends and going after them, Ariston takes them to court. He files a formal prosecution.
Why?
Strategically, he's tempering that raw urge for revenge. He presents himself to the jury as a modest and good citizen, someone who respects the laws, trusts the polis to deliver justice for him. Using the court system like this was itself a performance.
Showing his own good character while highlighting Conan's thuggery.
Exactly. But sometimes that food wasn't tempered. Sometimes it blew up into this massive, public, almost theatrical drama like the famous spat between Demosthenes and Medias.
Ah, that one's legendary. It went on for years, didn't it?
Oh yeah, a classic example of sustained ecthra. You had public insults, slander. Medius even broke into Demosthenes' house.
Wow.
And the final straw. Medius punches Demosthenes, not just anywhere, but while Demosthenes is acting as a Trargos sponsoring a chorus during the major religious festival of the Dionysia.
That's a massive public insult, violating sacred time and civic duty.
Huge violation. So Demosthenes doesn't just sue him normally. He uses a special procedure, the probola.
What was that exactly? How did it work?
The probola was like a preliminary hearing, but held before the entire citizen assembly. You basically stood up and accused someone publicly, asking the whole city, do you agree this guy committed hubris against me, this outrageous insult, and deserves a full trial?
So maximum publicity. Really airing the dirty laundry.
Maximum publicity, maximum political pressure. But here's the twist. Demosthenes, after all that buildup, he settles. Medius pays him off. 30 minae, a pretty substantial sum.
And people were furious, right?
Yeah.
Accused him of selling the insult.
They were. Because the expectation, really, to truly vindicate your honor through Dago was often to crush your opponent, get them exiled, ruined financially, taking money. That made it look like it wasn't about principle or public good, just personal profit. Damaged his reputation.
And the legal concept he was using there was hubris. The sources stressed this wasn't just assault. It was specifically about protecting status.
That's crucial. Hubris law wasn't just about a broken bone. It was about intentional, degrading insult, wanton violence aimed at diminishing someone's honor, their civic standing.
So things like physical assault on free citizens, sexual violence, attacks on honor.
Exactly. And significantly, the law was especially strong if the victim was assaulted while holding public office. The core idea of hubris was protecting civic status, maintaining that delicate social hierarchy within the citizen body.
Okay, so when citizens were found guilty, Athens seems to have been, well, maybe a bit cautious about really brutal public punishments for its own people, compared to, say, Rome later.
Generally, yes. For citizens, the common penalties were things like heavy fines, exile, or atimia, the loss of civic rights, which was devastating, a kind of social death, but not usually a bloody spectacle in the agora. Public humiliation was used, but maybe more sparingly for citizens, not for everyday stuff.
But when Athens wanted to make a point, especially against enemies, then the gloves came off.
Oh, absolutely. Then the brutality could be spectacular and highly symbolic. Think about those gloomy iron chains.
Right, the ones from the captured Boeotians and Chalcidians.
Thucydides tells us the Athenians proudly kept those chains, hung them up on the Acropolis, dedicated to Athena. They were a permanent public trophy, a constant reminder. This is what happens if you challenge Athens. Bitter bondage.
And the ransom was high too, right? 2 minas a man.
Making it humiliating and profitable. It wasn't just punishment. It was domination made visible.
And we also see moments where truly terrifying punishments were considered, even if not carried out.
Yeah.
Like with the Phocians.
Yeah, the Amphictyonic Council, that League of Greek States, was debating what to do with the Phocians after the Sacred War. Some members, apparently driven by religious fury and political hatred, actually proposed throwing all the Phocian men of military age off a cliff.
Good grief. Mass execution.
Total annihilation. It shows that extreme measures were always on the table in these high-stakes conflicts, even if, in that specific case, Philip of Macedon stepped in and stopped it for his own political reasons.
So this potential for brutality, even if often reserved for non-citizens or enemies, it was the constant reality for slaves in Athens, wasn't it? The law might have offered some theoretical protection, but
Theoretical is the word. Athenian law did say you shouldn't inflict wanton and demeaning violence on a slave, unless, of course, it was their own master doing it.
a pretty big exception.
A huge one. And even against others, how effective was that law? The sources give us this really grim story of Ptolemachus, a public slave.
What happened to him?
He was tied to a whipping post, and several citizens just lashed him viciously. Now, technically, they shouldn't have abused a public slave not belonging to them.
Yeah.
Ptolemachus actually tried to bring charges.
Yeah.
Failed. The citizens were powerful. He was, well, a slave. He ended up having to settle out of court, probably got next to nothing. It shows the law was there on paper, but power, status, the ability to inflict pain without consequence.
Yeah.
That was the real currency. So if Athens was about this sort of communal, sometimes chaotic jury system, trying to manage private feuds within a civic framework, Rome moves in a very different direction, towards centralization, bureaucracy.
Yeah, a totally different feel. We see the old Republican jury courts, the Quaestia Perpetua starting to fade away. What was behind that?
Power, basically. The Quaestio courts were very much a product of the Republic, citizen juries, public prosecutors. As emperors consolidated power, they wanted more direct control over justice. Juries could be unpredictable, politically swayed.
So they were replaced by something else.
They were gradually sidelined by the cognitio extra ordinum, the procedure outside the ordinary. Rolls right off the tongue, doesn't it?
Sounds a bit ominous. What did it mean in practice?
It meant a fundamental change. Instead of a jury trial, you had a magistrate or someone they appointed hearing the whole case, weighing evidence, deciding the verdict, and deciding the sentence. All by themselves.
So much more top-down. Bureaucratic.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
classic bureaucracy. Efficient, maybe, but it takes the power away from the community, from the jury, and puts it squarely in the hands of a state official. Even long-standing jury courts, like the one for adultery established by the Lex Julia, eventually got absorbed into this cognitio system.
And this centralization didn't create a level playing field. Instead, it seems like it formalized inequality. It baked social hierarchy right into the punishment system.
That's the absolute core reality of Roman punishment. Centralization allowed the state to write inequality into law. It created this stark dual penalty system. Your social status almost entirely dictated how severely you'd be punished.
The split was between the honestiores and the humiliores.
Precisely. Honestiores, the more honorable, that's senators, knights, military veterans, local bigwigs. Humiliores, the lower ones, common citizens, freedmen, most people, really.
And the difference in punishment was significant.
Massive. Life and death, significant. If an honestior committed a capital crime, they might face exile, maybe confiscation of property, loss of rank. If a humilior committed the same crime,
Yeah.
they faced the gruesome stuff. Crucifixion, being burned alive, thrown to wild beasts in the arena for public entertainment. The legal texts, the jurists themselves, openly talk about this. They use different terms when counting up offenders, humiliore loco, humilimo loco, clearly marking people out for harsher treatment based purely on their social standing.
So for the Roman elite, the main goal was avoiding that kind of public degrading execution.
Absolutely. Maintaining dignity, even in disgrace, was paramount. In the late Republic and early Empire, the main escape route from a death sentence was interdictio aqua et igni.
Interdiction from fire and water. Sounds symbolic.
It was. Before the final sentence was passed, an accused noble could choose voluntary exile, leave Italy, forfeit citizenship, property, all legal rights. It wasn't technically execution by the state, but it was social and political death. A way to avoid the axe or the cross, keep some shred of elite status intact, even in ruin.
But the state, particularly the Senate, still found ways to police the elite, right? Focusing on things like moral lapses.
Oh, definitely. The Senate took a keen interest in conspicuous moral lapses. Adultery trials, for example. Often these weren't really about the adultery itself. They were political attacks disguised as moral policing, a way to damage a rival family's reputation, their public standing.
Like the case of Vistilia.
Perfect example, daughter of a senator. Her crime wasn't political plotting. She apparently tried to register herself as a common prostitute with the local officials.
Why would she do that?
Who knows the personal reasons? But the public crime was the immense shame she brought on her noble family. The Senate tried her, and the punishment: exile. Shipped off to Seriphos, a barren little island. It shows for the elite the ultimate punishment wasn't necessarily physical pain, but loss of status, public disgrace, being cast out from their privileged world. And as the empire went on, this centralized judicial power became even more concentrated in the hands of key imperial officials.
Like the urban prefect in Rome and the praetorian prefect.
Exactly those two. They gradually accumulated enormous criminal jurisdiction. They could try basically anyone, regardless of class, and hand down capital sentences. Emperor Septimius Severus, for example, formally gave the urban prefect authority over all crimes within 100 miles of Rome.
A huge zone of control.
Massive. Total authority over the heartland, including the power of life and death, essentially. It's a world away from the Athenian assembly or juries deciding things.
But even with all that power, there's still this idea, this expectation of clementia mercy.
Yes, clementia was important, but it was complicated. It wasn't a right people had, especially not the humiliors. It was more like a virtue the emperor or his top officials were expected to display, to show they weren't just tyrants.
So it was a performance of good rulership.
Pretty much. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor, supposedly chewed out one of his prefects for not showing enough mercy. Using clementia wisely reinforced the emperor's image as a benevolent ruler. Withholding it showed the terrifying absolute power of the state. It was a tool, really.
Let's pivot slightly to how the Romans thought about crime itself. Cicero makes this interesting distinction between two ways of causing injury.
Ah, yes, Cicero. He breaks it down very clearly. Injury can happen either through force, which he calls the way of the lion, brute strength, or through fraud, deception, the way of the fox.
And which did he think was worse?
Fraud. He explicitly says fraud is worthy of the greater hatred.
Really? Why would sneaky deception be worse than outright violence?
I think it taps into that core Roman value of fides: trust, good faith, reliability. Violence is bad, obviously, but fraud. Fraud eats away at the very fabric of society. It undermines contracts, relationships, civic trust. Cicero says the worst criminals aren't just unjust, they're the ones who are so deceptive that they seem to be good men. That hidden betrayal was seen as particularly corrosive.
Okay, that makes sense. What about slavery in Rome? We know was foundational. How did the law deal with, say, a slave causing damage?
Roman law viewed slaves primarily as property, as assets. Cicero even compares them to mercenaries, make them work, but give them their just due so they keep working effectively. Utilitarian.
And if they broke something or hurt someone?
The law was quite specific. If a slave caused damage deliberately, acting wrongfully, and the owner didn't know about it or order it, the slave was liable. The default legal outcome was the slave's death.
Just like that.
Unless, and this was the common alternative, the owner chose to pay compensation for the damage instead. It was called noxal surrender, in a sense. The owner could either hand over the slave, originally for punishment, later often just pay the value, or pay the fine. The slave's life was essentially weighed against the cost of the damage.
Grim calculus. But Roman law did have ways to protect the honor of free people, right? Even if it reflected the social structure.
Yes. The action for injuria, insult, or outrage could be used if, say, someone physically insulted your wife. Legally, the right to sue belonged to the husband, the wife's father, and the wife herself.
So she could sue in her own name.
Technically, yes. But the commentary from the jurists makes the social reality clear. They say it's proper for wives to be defended by their husbands, not the other way around. It reinforces that patriarchal idea that a woman's honor is under the protection of her male relatives.
And underlying all of this, whether in Athens or Rome, the constant factor seems to be status.
Absolutely. It always comes back to status. The Roman writer Gellius explicitly states that the whole system of having different punishments for injuria, depending on who is involved, existed for the preservation of prestige. The law wasn't trying to be blind. It was actively designed to uphold the existing social hierarchy. Your standing determined the protection you received and the punishment you faced.
So looking back over this whole landscape, it's quite a journey. The Greek approach, particularly in Athens, seems so rooted in the specific context of the polis, this constant negotiation between private anger, that ekthra, and public law, dikko. a system heavily reliant on persuasion, rhetoric, performance in court.
Yeah, messy, dynamic, very human system in a way, constantly trying to balance individual honor with civic order, and then you contrast that with Rome.
Which just sweeps away a lot of that ambiguity, right? Builds this huge, centralized bureaucratic machine for justice.
Exactly, a machine that's maybe more predictable, more efficient in some ways, but one that explicitly writes social inequality into its very code. That dual penalty system based on whether you're honester or humilior, it's brutal in its clarity. Status determines everything.
But in both systems, Athens and Rome, it's so clear that punishment wasn't just about applying legal rules. It was always a performance, a way to shore up authority, reinforce social norms.
Definitely. Whether it's the Athenians displaying captured enemy chains on the Acropolis as a stark warning, or a Roman governor carefully choosing when to show clementia to project benevolent power, the act of punishing was a powerful statement about who held power and how society was ordered.
Which brings us back to that fundamental tension, maybe most visible in Athens, but present everywhere. That prosecutor using his personal vendetta as fuel for public justice.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? We like to think our modern legal systems are purely rational, based on abstract principles of justice and equality. But can any system ever truly filter out that deep human need for, well, for retribution, for that personal sense of satisfaction when a wrong is righted?
Is that element of vengeance, that ectra, maybe still humming away beneath the surface of our own systems, even if we don't like to admit it? What are we missing if we only look for the legal theory and ignore that persistent, very human desire for an accounting?